right, QCP back on the internet. It's a podcast, folks. You know that. You're listening to it. Thank you again for listening. I'm Dan McClellan. He's Rob Helton. And we do this thing called the Questioning Christianity Podcast. And we're glad that you're along with us for another ride. We've got several questions to get to. So thanks for sending those in. So we'll do that at the end of the episode. We're going to get back into the red letters this week. And that's my dog.
Hey, doggy. Where'd you come from? Hey, Katie.
Hi.
All right, how are you?
All right, let's go. Come on, outside.
Sorry.
All right. Well, if that ain't a way to start the podcast, I don't know what is.
Yeah, that will include all of that.
All right. So, Rob, this is episode number 30 for us, a major milestone.
Oh, yeah, every 5 episodes.
Every 5 episodes, we make some sort of to-do about it.
Yeah.
But this one maybe
When are we going to have cake?
Well, my birthday's like next month.
Okay.
And so I might have some cake for that.
Well, maybe it'll fall on the 30th episode.
I don't think at the pace that we're able to achieve, we're going to get 5 episodes in like 1 month.
Okay, well, too bad.
But yeah, and then the other significant milestone is that we've had 5,000 downloads.
Yeah, that's great.
That's kind of wild, right?
That is wild.
So when we started this podcast, I remember asking you, we were sitting, I think, at a Mexican restaurant, and we were talking about it. What would success look like for us? You know, how many people listening? I mean, if it was like 40 or 50, would that be good? And so I don't remember the answer to that. I think we just decided to do it regardless. But 5,000, that's pretty cool.
We decided to measure success in some other ways besides numbers of people.
Yeah.
And hopefully, and we may not even ever have this information, but hopefully if it actually helps somebody, that would be success, we decided. And so we decided it was worth it.
I think so. And I think it's been helpful for me. So I've enjoyed it. And I think that you folks are listening to our 30th episode here. Hopefully you are enjoying it as well. All right. So we're doing red letters. We're getting very close to the end of the Sermon on the Mount. I think I made this point last time, but the way we've kind of framed this whole conversation is about the kingdom of God and the kingdom of heaven and how it has come. It is something that's happening here and now. And the people that are on the outside are now on the inside, and the golden rule. And then it takes this really dark, kind of nasty turn.
Yeah. Not
nasty, but it just, it's like, hey, and I know that not many of you guys are going to follow this. There's only this narrow gate.
Yeah.
And then we're going to get kind of, kind of that same sort of darker tone, I think, with this next passage.
Yeah.
It deals with kind of true and false prophets and disciples. So.
Yes. This section, I think, beginning with what our last episode where we talked about the broad way versus the narrow way, you might think of it as kind of the conclusion of the sermon. And as he does, it seems that Jesus you might see Jesus reflecting on the teachings that he's been sharing and realizing that these are life-altering teachings and that they require something of those who would be his disciples. If you're going to follow me, Jesus would say, you're going to have to take up your cross and follow me. And so the conclusion of the sermon, he gets really, really serious. Like you said, it's almost has almost a dark feel to it, where he talks about just how serious this is. And this section that you're getting ready to read, I think, will show that pretty clearly.
That narrow path, and we described it as like crushing and hard and that sort of thing. And so now he says in verse 15, watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them.
Yeah.
That's good stuff.
That is good stuff.
Just want to wrap it up there for today?
Yeah, we could just quit with that, and everybody could go home happy.
Who's he talking about? Who are these false prophets?
That's the big question, and maybe that's where we can start. Let's think about it.
And are we at risk of being cut down and thrown into the fire?
Yeah, well, we might think of that more as in terms of casting ourselves into the fire. From time to time, I think we do that. For now, let's focus on the question, who is Jesus talking about when he talks about the false prophets? Well, particularly since we read this in the book of Matthew, the people that are in mind here are this group called the Pharisees. they really get highlighted in the ministry of Jesus, like I said, particularly in Matthew's gospel, because they are adamantly opposed to everything that Jesus is about. And Jesus doesn't cut them any slack. He calls them on it. He points out where they fall short and where they're hypocritical and where they say one thing and do another, and where their teachings are not consistent with the character of God. So probably when Jesus says, watch out for the false prophets, he's thinking about this group called the Pharisees. If he's thinking about the Pharisees, what was it about the Pharisees that's false? What is it that they did or said that was adamantly opposed to everything that Jesus was teaching and doing? Okay, so a couple things we know about the Pharisees. They were very devout, by the way. When you think about the Pharisees, we probably would do well not to demonize them too much. I tell church members, the Pharisees were like us.
Yeah.
They were the weekly worshipers. They were like the people, as we in our vernacular, who show up every time the doors are open.
Yeah.
They were always at synagogue.
Very devoted.
Yeah. They were not ashamed of their spirituality. They stood on the street corners and said their prayers. They didn't hide their devotion to the one true God. So they were very devout. They were very sincere. And in their sincerity, they had this very strong belief. And the belief was that if the nation of Israel would just turn to God and be pure, be chaste, follow all of the religious requirements.
And they had a lot.
They had added a bunch to the Torah, the law. In fact, there was, I think, one rabbi who said that if all of Israel would follow the law meticulously for just one day, then God would return and step in and deliver them from Roman oppression. That's a paraphrase, but they really believe this, that if Israel would just be pure, then God would intervene on their behalf. God would overthrow Rome. Jerusalem would become the capital of Israel once again. They would win their independence. They would be a world leader, God's blessed nation. So that was their belief. Now, to get at that, then, they became very exclusionary. They would exclude people who did not measure up to their purity standards, because we've got to be pure. And so anybody that's not pure, we have to cast them out. Well, like you quarantine somebody in a hospital so that the infection doesn't spread. And Jesus went against all of that. Jesus hung out with the sinners. Jesus touched people who were ceremonially unclean, which would have technically caused Jesus to become unclean, but everybody that Jesus touched who was unclean, they became clean.
Yeah.
So that was one thing about the Pharisees.
Well, I just want to, you said something one time, you said you tell church people not to demonize the Pharisees.
Yeah.
And then you start describing the Pharisees, and you can't help, I think, or at least I can't help, but as you talk about the rules, and if the country will just do this, and we can, it sounds very familiar, especially like here in the Bible Belt. Were you suggesting, hey, don't demonize the Pharisees too much because you're kind of demonizing yourself? Or are we giving these guys a bad rap more than they deserve?
Yeah, maybe a little of both.
Okay.
I think what we have to say, in all fairness to the Pharisees, is that they weren't sinister. They were sincere.
Okay.
They were sincere followers of God, and if they looked at themselves in the mirror, they wouldn't see hypocrites that were opposing God. They would see sincere people who were trying to do the right thing. So, yeah, I want us to give them a fair shake.
Okay.
Part of it. And the other part is what you alluded to. You never see yourself reflected in somebody you demonize.
Right.
Once you demonize them, once you put them in the bad category, then you can no longer see any of their traits reflected in your traits. So let's not demonize them for that reason as well, because I do believe that the church has a lot to learn from Jesus' interaction with the Pharisees, and we'd have to change the vernacular very little to bring it up to 21st century. You sort of started down that road a minute ago. We hear an awful lot of talk about how impure the sinners are around us, how bad Hollywood is, and we tend to highlight like the sexual sins of our culture.
Mhm.
And if the church would, could just be right with God.
Yeah, we could get him back in America again.
Yeah, then the country would be right again.
Yeah, and then they quote that verse from Chronicles or whatever. I can't remember it now.
Yeah,
At least I remembered that there is a verse. So
yeah,
that's pretty
yeah.
good. You know what I'm talking about?
I can't quote it now either. But about my
and heal their
people,
land.
if my people will humble themselves,
there you go,
and pray, then I'll hear from heaven.
I was there
and
for
heal
that
their land.
Sunday.
Yeah, First Chronicles 7:14.
Oh,
I grew
man.
up with that.
No editing, folks. No editing there.
Yeah. I don't know if that's exactly right or not. But that just is what springs to mind. But really, I mean, that we tend to talk that way.
Yeah.
And here's the thing, Dan, that I don't think we're getting too far afield when we talk about this. The Pharisees were nationalistic. They didn't make any separation between who they were as a nation and their relationship with God. That's why they could be exclusionary of all other nations and not feel any pain from doing so.
Oh, that's a good point.
They could exclude the Samaritans. They could exclude all Gentiles because Israel was God's chosen nation. Israel was the nation that received the blessing of God. Because they forget the part where God told Abraham, I'm going to bless you so that you can be a blessing to others. Israel as a nation was supposed to bless other nations, not exclude them or curse them. Now, we hear that language in our country as well. America is God's, we were put here for a reason. And a really, really dark part of our chapter in our history is that our founding fathers, some of them, used that idea that we were the new Israel. We were the sort of the new city on a hill. And we use that as kind of an excuse to, when we came into this land, we actually wiped out whole people groups, natives of this land. We committed genocide. And we did that, and preachers endorsed it because they said we have a right to, because we're like the new Israelites. This is the new Canaan. We're invading. And so we can wipe people out. And they did. And it's very well documented, whether you're comfortable with it or not. We killed men, women, and children so that we could take their land. When I hear this language about, well, we just need God's man in Washington, and our country, we could take our country back for the Lord. I'm not sure that's what the kingdom of heaven is all about.
I mean, it does feel very much, like what the Pharisees were trying to do if they were, trying to overthrow Rome and create this combined government religion thing that you were describing. That's probably a bad way to summarize it. But, Jesus came not trying to be political. I guess he was political, but he didn't try to obtain political power or overthrow the government and that sort of thing. And so he sort of went around preaching the kingdom and living day to day in a new way. And wouldn't that be a better, I guess, for a believer, for a person of faith, for a Christian, it would be better to say something along those lines, that we should all just, try to follow the teachings of Jesus versus if we could just get our man or woman in Washington.
Yeah. It's really dangerous to believe that you can accomplish the purposes of God through the means of human beings, because human beings tend to resort to bad ways of doing things, which probably not a very articulate way of saying it. In other words, you can't let the end justify the means with Jesus. For Jesus, it all blended together, the means and the end. You can't say, well, we want to take our nation back for the Lord, and so it's going to be okay for us to slander people or for us to do some, backdoor kind of political maneuvering or whatever. Or you could say we've got to maintain our rightful place in the world, so it's okay for us to bomb our enemies and do whatever we have to do to maintain our power. even if we went down the nationalism route, it seems to me that a nation who claims the sovereignty and the blessing of God would not need to invest as much in military power. We invest more money in military than the next 25 nations combined,
Sure.
I've heard.
Yeah.
So that sort of thing.
But, and then one could say that investment or expense puts us in a position where people like you and me can kind of sit around freely on podcasts and debate these sorts of things.
Yeah.
Let's make sure we're on like the false prophets part of this. So would Jesus describe like the people in Washington as the false prophets, or the people like us that put them there? If he's talking about Pharisees.
I think that any of us are in danger of falling into that camp. I think you read the passage where it says, a good tree doesn't bear bad fruit, a bad tree doesn't bear good fruit. So is Jesus saying that a bad tree will always be a bad tree, and a good tree will always be a good tree, and a bad tree will never be able to bear good fruit, and a good tree will never be able to bear bad fruit? Or is it more like there is a possibility for me to choose to be a bad tree and bear bad fruit?
I was going to say, we all make bad fruit.
Sure. I don't think that you can just sort of rest on your laurels and say, okay, I know I'm a Christian, so whatever I do is not bad fruit. I think that we
peach.
can, I think that we can choose. I can go from one to the other. I can sort of gravitate back and forth. When I am a good tree, when I am entrusting myself to Jesus and following his way, the result of that will always be good. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to remember that. Let me bring us back a little bit to the other thing that I was going to say about the Pharisees, and you alluded to it a minute ago. The other thing that some of the Pharisees and some others were in favor of, here, this is not everybody. It's sort of nobody always falls into the exact same grouping. The Pharisees were on a continuum, but some of them advocated the violent overthrow of Rome. Mm-hmm. So the use of violence to accomplish the purposes of God. So those two things, if we would just be a pure nation, then God would act on our behalf. If we could just exclude all the sinners and sort of put them out, then God would act on our behalf, and he would do it through a Messiah who would lead us to violently overthrow our oppressors. Those were the hinges of the Pharisaical philosophy. You can see then from what Jesus has already taught that his teaching runs diametrically opposed to primarily those two things that the Pharisees, that were the foundations of their philosophy. Mm-hmm. Jesus included everybody. He didn't exclude anybody, He invited everybody in. And Jesus resisted violence and taught nonviolence, as we've talked about.
So we know now who our false prophets are, sort of. At least we've got some indications, because they're basically saying, like, here is God's way, but they're giving means that are diametrically opposed to the ones that Jesus just laid out for us.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then what happens to these false prophets? They get cut down and thrown into the fire.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
All right, there's a couple of ways that you can think about this, and the way that we tend to gravitate toward is to say, okay, if you mess up, God's going to get you.
Yeah.
He's going to cut you down and throw you into the fire.
Yeah. Johnny Cash said that.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, Johnny is the leading theologian, and we have to follow.
He is pretty awesome.
Yeah. He's not a bad theologian for sure, or was it? And we tend to do this with a lot of the things that Jesus says. We tend to maybe read more into what he's saying than what is actually there. When Jesus says that every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire, what if Jesus is simply making the observation that the false prophets and those who follow them, in their self-defeating objectives and methods, that the natural outcome of that simply is that they will be cut down and thrown into the fire? not necessarily that God is the active agent in judging them, and God's doing the cutting down, and God's doing the casting them into fire. But like God does with humanity, is letting them choose a path, a broad way, that just leads to destruction. And it is simply the natural outcome of the choices that they made. And I would argue then, Dan, that history proves this out. In 70 AD, 70 years after the ministry of Jesus, the Jews, actually starting in 63, AD 63, the Jews revolt against Rome. Rome sends in their general, their best general, Titus, I think it is. If I remember my history correctly. They lay siege to Jerusalem, and it becomes a bloodbath, and it becomes literally they were thrown into the fire.
Yeah, the 60s was a really revolutionary and kind of violent decade.
Yeah, the 60s, just the 60s, not the 1960s. This very literally comes true.
Yeah.
That those who follow this kind of theology of God's on our side and all we have to do is kill our enemies, and all those sinners out there, if we could just get rid of them, God would step in and everything would be great,
It sounds like Jesus is saying, that's just not going to work. You're never going to get the fruit that you want doing life this way. And
so I think that's what he's saying here. Study the history sometime. It was the fall of Jerusalem under Rome. It was, Josephus is a Jewish historian who describes it, and it was just absolutely beyond our modern imagination what those people went through. Who led that revolt or who got caught up in that revolt.
We want to look at the next section.
Yeah, let's give it a quick shot.
All right.
Yeah.
And then to questions. So in verse 21 it says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.
I think that this is just kind of following up on what we're saying about these false prophets, these false disciples who claim a relationship with God through Christ, but they're not claiming it based on their sincere belief in who Jesus is and what Jesus taught. Say I'm a TV evangelist or whatever, and I tout my faith, and I talk about how much I believe in Jesus. And I encourage other people to put their faith in Jesus and pray the sinner's prayer or whatever it is that we do to, kind of get people to seal the deal. But then I turn around and I say, we need to go bomb those people over in the Middle East. Well, in that moment, I haven't believed in Jesus.
Yeah, it's like a bad piece of fruit.
Exactly. Yeah. Because if I believe in Jesus, then I believe that what he said was true. And so I refrain from violence against my enemies and endorsing violence. At the end of the age, on that day, Jesus says, however, there's different ideas about that exactly, but let's just say it's the end of the age. And you have people who have claimed the name of Jesus but haven't entered into or followed the teachings of Jesus. There's just a disconnect there that cannot be reconciled, and Jesus is going to say that cannot be reconciled.
I mean, maybe it's that part of the mystery. We just don't know exactly how that will play out.
Well, for sure, it's not our call.
Yeah.
We say in the Apostles' Creed that we believe that Jesus will judge the living and the dead. And I do believe that. Now, how that happens and what comes out of that, not only do I believe that we don't have a say in it, I don't know that we can ever imagine what it will be like. What I do believe, based on my understanding of the character of Jesus, is that God is love, that anything that happens in this world, in this age or the age to come, is always an overflow of his love, whatever that is. We have to be careful that we don't create a dualism kind of understanding of God, that on one hand, God is love, but on the other hand, God is wrath.
Yeah, he does call you like an evildoer and says, get away from me.
Yeah, but in that instance, that's not like the bad God coming out.
Yeah.
Whatever happens in judgment, it's always an overflow of God's love. It's not, on one hand, God he really wants to love, but on the other hand, he's, it's got all this anger.
I just had this dumb mental image that I have to say, or it won't leave me.
Okay, go ahead.
That Jesus is like Bill Bixby. You remember he played the, I can't think of the character's name, but on the Incredible Hulk TV show.
Yeah.
But God is like Lou Ferrigno,
Yeah.
And so like, you wouldn't like me when I'm angry.
Yeah.
Come on. So that's God's not like the Incredible Hulk.
No.
If that's helpful to you.
Yeah.
I'm sure it is.
That'll help. Yeah.
All right. So the one difference I see between this paragraph and the one we read earlier in the show is that Jesus has like explicitly put himself into the scene here.
Yeah.
Is he still talking about Pharisees at this point as being those false disciples?
I think that probably, at least for the readers of Matthew's gospel, certainly have the Pharisees in mind and those who would follow the Pharisees.
Yeah, and you said Matthew is a little more rough on the Pharisees than...
Yeah, read Matthew chapter 23. It's pretty scathing critique of the Pharisees. And among other things, Jesus says, you tithe on your mint, dill, and cumin. You make sure that you even give a tenth of your spices so that you're not breaking a law, but then you miss the greater law of justice and mercy. Jesus talked about the Pharisees somehow, we're not exactly sure how they did it, but confiscating widows' houses. Apparently they're evicting widows, and yet they show up at the temple and make sure that they tithe. Jesus does give, he really rakes them out for that.
Okay, so that makes it a little bit easier to understand. Sometimes we read these passages, I think, and we put ourselves, I don't know, we read into it. I think you said this. We read into it maybe more than what is really there. And so we start to put together this story of what's going to happen in the end times. And, hey, am I going to be the guy who Jesus says, I never knew you,
Yeah.
And then what do I need to do to make sure I'm not that guy? And
Yeah.
you get worried about that sort of thing. Or is the pastor at my church a false prophet or a true prophet? And how do I know?
Well, I think one of the questions that we got this week, well, maybe we can get at addressing that whole problem of at the end of the age, am I going to be in or am I going to be out? Am I going to be one of the ones who he says, I never knew you, or one of the ones he says, enter into the joy of the Lord? Maybe that's a good transition into our questions.
Into questions? All right, so we got some good ones. You want to start with the hard one or the easy ones?
Let's get the hard one over with first.
All right, question number 1. And you guys, please keep sending those in. So thank you to everyone who did. And you can do that through our website, questioningchristianitypodcast.com, or through Facebook. That seems like the way that most people like to do that. Facebook.com/questioningchristianity. All right, question is, in your last episode, you used the illustration of faith being like a wet paint sign. Yeah, I think you did it was like a park bench kind of an analogy with the wet paint sign. And you said that believing in Jesus is like believing in the sign. So if you read the sign and believe it, then you obey it and are saved from messing up your clothes. All right, I remember that from last time. But isn't that just another form of works salvation? You're still saying that you have to obey to be saved. All right, works salvation is kind of a churchy term that I certainly have heard before. We want to sometimes say you don't have to do anything. You just have to believe. But then it sounds like we may be saying, in order to believe, here are the things you have to do.
Yeah, we're tripping ourselves up any way we go at it, because the ones who really want to make a sort of a big deal about, well, you're talking about working your way to heaven. When you tell people, in order to be saved, that's terminology that we use, you've got to put your faith in Jesus, say the sinner's prayer, ask him to forgive your sins, and have faith in him, believe in him. Well, all of that is you've got to do these things. That's just another way. You've just replaced one kind of work with another kind of work. Maybe what we need to do is rethink what we mean when we talk about salvation. If when you talk about being saved, then you're just talking about getting to heaven when you die, then I think that you're adding apples and oranges. You're just not talking about the same thing the Bible's talking about when it talks about salvation. Biblical salvation is technically, to be saved is to be set free. It's deliverance. We trace that term all the way back to the children of Israel being delivered from Egyptian bondage, Egyptian slavery. But it's being delivered from who I am without God. Salvation is the transformation of me. It's not about me getting all my theology right or my prayers right or my ducks in a row so that I can get to heaven when I die. It is about me entering into a relationship of trust with Jesus Christ so that I am transformed as a human being and I become the kind of person who actually wants to go to heaven, who actually would be at home in heaven with God. You're absolutely right. We can't work our way into salvation. And so anything that we receive, we receive as a free gift from God, including our own personal transformation. It's a work of the Spirit. Yet the transformation needs to happen. It's just like these false prophets that we've been talking about. You can say, Lord, Lord, all you want to, but if you don't open up to allow the Lord to change who you are, then you're just sort of missing out on it. I think we have to come back to this idea of mystery a little bit and to the mystical aspect of it, but it's all about us being changed as human beings. I think we've talked about before the passage in Acts chapter 16 where Paul and Silas have been, or was it Barnabas? Paul and Silas have been beaten and put into jail because they were evangelizing. And in jail at midnight, they're singing hymns and they're worshiping the Lord. An earthquake comes, the jail doors open, the chains fall off, they can escape if they want to. And the Roman prison warden, the guy who keeps the prisoners, he believes that everybody's escaped, and so he decides to kill himself because he knows that the Romans will kill him anyway. But Paul cries out, he says, don't do yourself any harm. We're all here. Nobody's escaped. And then the jailer runs in, and he falls down before Paul, and he says, Paul and Silas, and he says, Sirs, what must I do to be saved? So the question is, what is the jailer asking?
Yeah, what's he asking
them? Is he saying, what must I do to get to heaven when I die? That is undoubtedly not what he's talking about. What I would argue that what he's saying is, what must I do to become the kind of person that can sing hymns after someone has beaten me? What must I do to become a different kind of person, to be transformed? And that's what salvation is all about.
Good question. We talk about this show being kind of geared for the Bible Belt. Yeah, Michael contacted us. He lives in South Africa. That's not in the Bible Belt.
No.
The question was about, let's see, if the Bible was written by God, why do they keep revising it and why? And so we probed a little bit, and so I think he's talking about all the different translations. And so, for instance, when we get together and do this podcast, I use this app that, I don't know, I want to say there are like 60 or 70 different translations I can choose from.
Yeah, and I think that's the gist of what was being asked. Let's just back up a little bit and just remind everybody that the Bible comes to us, it's a very ancient document, and it comes to us originally and primarily in ancient Hebrew and Greek. And so those are, of course, foreign languages to us, and they have to be translated for us to be able to read and understand, and they have been. And by the way, we don't have any of the original manuscripts. In other words, we don't have anything that the Apostle Paul actually sat down and wrote with his own hand. We have copies of what Paul wrote. We have copies of copies, but we have enough of those copies to be able to say that we have really reliable ancient manuscripts so that we can say confidently that we know what the original writers actually wrote down. And so down through the ages, those translations have been done. Most people are familiar with what was called the authorized version, the King James Version, but there are other good translations. Most translations are actually pretty good, and it's a good idea to maybe have more than one and read the different translations and compare them. And as much as possible, if you can go back and do a little bit of word study, there are good Bible dictionaries that can help you with that. And all these tools are good. The Bible itself is not being revised, just translated. And there are, like I said, many of those translations.
Sure. And, they're not always words that go like one for one from one language to the other.
Yeah.
I think it's probably fair to say, maybe you can tell me if I'm right or disagree or whatever, that certain translations may have an agenda, have sort of a slant. And so is there one that you would recommend someone to, this is a pretty safe, accurate translation?
Yeah.
You've studied Greek and that sort of thing, so you know a little bit more about this than I guess I do.
Yeah, I think that, like I said, most of the at least the well-known translations that are out there are good translations. The one that I think we read here sometimes is the NIV, the New International Version, and that's because it does a good job putting the sort of the ancient language into more modern vernacular. The Revised Standard Version, I think, is a really good translation. The American Standard is a good translation. I'm trying to think of others. And there are some paraphrases, I think, that help to get to the meaning of the words. Now, there's a difference between a translation and a paraphrase. A translation takes the ancient language, the Greek or the Hebrew, and translates it into English. A paraphrase might take an English translation and then paraphrase it and put it in different language to make it more understandable. Like the Amplified Bible is a paraphrase. I think the Living Bible is a paraphrase.
The Message?
The Message is, although Eugene Peterson, who translated the Message, he goes back to the original languages, but then he expands on those. He takes a lot of liberty, but I mean, I think he does a good job with it. But the Message is a good translation / paraphrase to read to get at, I think, a more clear meaning of some of the text.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for the question, Michael. Hopefully that gives you something to start with, and you can check out some of those translations. The last question comes from Ellie. She wants to know why we have an advertisement on our website for a free copy of the Book of Mormon.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you asked, because we want to make clear that we're not advertising for the Book of Mormon.
I told her that I felt like that was a pretty good deal, though. Free.
I don't know how they slip those in, but
well, yeah, it's just it's an automated service, and so you could even bid to have your advertisement put on our website, and it'd be great if you did. That would help us pay for the cost of the podcast. So we're just trying to generate a little bit of revenue. We do try to keep filtered those, advertisements that might be inappropriate. So that one being under the category of religion fits in with what we do from an advertising standpoint. But we're not necessarily promoting that everyone get a free copy of the Book of Mormon.
Just to be clear, we didn't okay that to be on there. It just showed up, right?
If we had free tickets to the musical, The Book of Mormon, that would be cool. But we don't have that. All right, thanks for sending those questions in. Keep it up. Anything we need to talk about, or are we ready to hit stop?
I think we're good for now.
All right, QCP out.